Section 6. For these reasons, then, with death holding greater sway and corruption remaining fast against human beings, the race of humans was perishing, and the human being, made rational and in the image, was disappearing, and the work made by God was being obliterated. So, again, for these reasons, we need to look at what were these reasons before. He's given us some of those reasons regarding human sinfulness, corruption, death, so on and so forth. We found ourselves. So we look back at that. For these reasons, then, with death holding greater sway and corruption remaining fast against human beings, they were perishing. Here's who they were. They were made rational and in the image, but here's the idea, is that it was disappearing. And the work made by God was being obliterated. And so the image of God and our likeness to him, remember, we were like God in some way. And it related to participation in the Word and that power. So our image of God and our likeness to him are waning in some ways. There are those who will make a distinction here, and I think it can be helpful, that all human beings still are created in the image of God, right? After the image of the Word. And I'm just going to write etc. because we'll talk more about what that looks like. But the idea is we're all still created in the image of God, but by our sinfulness, we less and less reflect his likeness. And I think that's a helpful way to look at it, and I think that's consistent with what Athanasius is saying here, is that the work made by God, that is human beings, was being obliterated. For as I said earlier, by the law, death therefore prevailed against us, and it was impossible to escape the law, since this had been established by God on account of on account of the transgression. So it was impossible to escape the law, since, right? Again, this is another one of our kind of reason statements. Why could we not escape the law? And that's what the since statement says. Because, what's the answer to that? The law was established by God himself. So God says, on the day that you eat of the fruit, you shall surely die. And what happened was truly both absurd and improper. It was absurd, on the one hand, that having spoken, God should prove to be lying. Right? So this is the absurdity, I guess we could say, that God should be lying. That is, having legislated that human being would die by death if he were to transgress the commandment, yet after the transgression he were not to die, but rather this sentence dissolved. Right? So, what is the absurdity? It would be absurd for God to promise death as the consequence of sin, and then ignore that promise. That would be absurdity. For God would not be true if, after saying that we would die, the human being did not die. On the other hand, right, so here we go. On the other hand, it was improper that what had once been made rational and partakers of his word should perish, and once again return to non-being through corruption. So, he's saying, not only is there an absurdity, but also what he would call the impropriety. Right? What is the impropriety? The impropriety is it would be improper for God, who created human beings in his own image, to be partakers of the word. Right, we see that right here, partakers of the word. We've used the word participate. And power. Let me just point that back out. Back here, we looked at this idea of participation in the word in section 5. And we looked at giving them a share of the power of his word here in section 3. So in section 6 here, we want to go back to participate. Section 5. Power was in section 3. We can point those things out. So it would be improper for God, who created human beings in his own image, to be partakers of the word, right? To participate in that power of the word. It would be improper for God, who created human beings in his own image, to be partakers of the word, to then allow them through corruption to return to non-being. All right? So it was not worthy of the goodness of God that those created by him should be corrupted through the deceit wrought by the devil upon human beings, and it was supremely improper that the workmanship of God in human beings should disappear either through their own negligence or through the deceit of demons. So in that previous sentence, right, that they should by the deceit wrought by the devil, but he doesn't leave it there as though it was only the devil's fault. He says, through their own negligence or through the deceit of demons. Either way, he's saying it would be improper that the workmanship of God should disappear. Right? So he seems to be suggesting here that it is consistent with who God is that he would do something that the ones he created in his own image would not be left to corruption. Right, that seems to be what he's suggesting. On the other hand, what he's kind of more directly saying in the words here is it is improper for God to let humanity, whom he created, disappear, right? To fall into nothingness. Whether that's their own negligence, which it was, or the deceit of demons, which it also was, right? So both of those are true. This is not an or statement, like one or the other. It could also be one or the other, or both. In this case, it's both. Therefore, since the rational creatures were being corrupted and such works were perishing, what should God, being good, do? And this is, in one sense, central to the entire argument of the book. All right? Central question, in some ways, of the entire treatise. This is why he's spent all this time talking about humanity. God created everything out of nothing. God created humanity in his own image to participate in the Word, the very Word who is the agent of creation, and after whose image we are created. He's created human beings for that purpose, but human beings, he made the promise, on the day that they eat of the fruit, they shall surely die. They eat of the fruit. It would now be absurd that God would go back on his promise and that they wouldn't die from that sin, but it would also be improper for God just to allow humanity created after his image to pass into non-being. So what should God, because he is good, right, being good, what should God do? What should God do given this? We'll call it a dilemma. Of course, God is not confused by it. What does that look like? Permit the corruption prevailing against them and death to seize them. That would be the second one, the impropriety of allowing them to perish. What need was there for their coming into being at the beginning? So if he's just going to allow them to die out because of their sin, why did he create them in the first place? And I know that's a favorite question of many people. It's a difficult one to answer simply. It's one that we can answer biblically, but it is one that's hard to answer simply because it requires a lot of explanation. Nevertheless, he's going to go into some of those things, so we don't need to do that here. He says, it was proper not to have come into being rather than to have come into being to be neglected and destroyed. So, for Athanasius, if God creates human beings and tells them on the day that you eat of the fruit you shall surely die, they eat of the fruit, it would be absurd that God would go back on that promise, but nevertheless, it would seem like totally irrational for God to have created human beings, to allow them to fall into sin, and then to just allow them to fall out of existence. So, the weakness rather than the goodness of God is made known by neglect if, after creating, he abandoned his own work to be corrupted, rather than if he had not created the human being in the beginning. So think back, right? This word weakness is helpful for us because it reminds us all the way back up in section 2. Remember this idea of the maker, the creator? He says they do not realize that saying such things is to impute weakness to God. And that was Plato's view that God made the universe from pre-existent and uncreated matter. So the fact that if God had to create from something that already existed, he would be weak. But Athanasius has already pointed out that God didn't create that way. He created out of nothing. And yet the fact that he could and did create humanity out of nothing, therefore there's no weakness in God. Nevertheless, he's saying it would still remain a weakness if God had just neglected his creation, the one that he had created out of nothing, and just allowed them to fall into non-being. So for not making him, there would have been no one considering the weakness. But once he made him and created him out of nothing, it was most absurd that his work should be destroyed, and especially before the sight of the Maker. So if God had chosen not to create at all, that would not have been a weakness. If God had to create out of a pre-existent matter, like Plato said, that would be a weakness. But God created out of nothing, yet nevertheless to allow humanity to remain in sin, Athanasius says, would be a weakness if he had allowed them to just fall into disrepair. So, what does he end with? It was therefore right not to permit human beings to be carried away by corruption, because this would be improper to and unworthy of the goodness of God. So this is kind of Athanasius' point. It was therefore right. Right. So he's talking about the rightness, we might say, the propriety as opposed to impropriety, the reasonableness as opposed to the absurdity of God doing something. What should God, being good, do? This is our question. Of course, I think you already know the answer. The answer is that God is going to redeem this humanity, and the means by which he will redeem humanity is the necessary incarnation of the Word as Jesus Christ. So the reason that Athanasius has spent so much time on humanity, creation, human sinfulness, is that it sets up the dilemma of this question. What is the right thing for God to do, considering he has created humanity in his own image? Humanity has fallen and should receive death, and it would be absurd for God to go back on his promise. What is it that God should do? Because he is good. And Athanasius says God should do something about it, and he will do something about it. He did do something about it, and he did it through the Incarnation. So this sets up all of what we need in order to understand the question of why God would become man in the Incarnation. So that's the end of section 6.